The Nepal Flash Flood, Rasuwa District, August 26, 2026. Note: this disaster occurred on August 26, 2026. The investigation is ongoing. All figures reflect verified reporting as of August 28, 2026. Death toll and missing persons numbers are expected to rise. On the morning of August 26, 2026, the weather in Nepal's Rasuwa district was clear. There were no storm warnings, no heavy rainfall in the immediate area, nothing to indicate that within minutes, entire villages would be gone. Then the water came. A massive wall of water, mud, and debris surged down the Botekoshi River Valley from the Nepal-Tibet border region. The flood moved so fast that in some areas, water levels in the Trishuli River rose by as much as 9 meters, roughly 30 feet, in just 30 minutes. Villages along the valley had no time to evacuate. In many cases, they had no warning at all. The settlements of Timur and Sayabrubesi in Rasuwa district were among the hardest hit. Buildings were swept away. Roads and bridges were destroyed. The floodwaters continued south, reaching the Nuwakot and Dading districts downstream. Across the border in Tibet, the Gyurong port area in China's Shigatse region was also struck by the surge. As of August 28, 2026, at least 547 people had been confirmed dead in Nepal, with an additional 5 fatalities on the Tibetan side of the border. Over 1,500 people remained missing across both countries, more than 644 of them foreign nationals from 32 countries, including 90 Americans. Among the missing were trekkers, pilgrims, and tourists who had been in the valley when the flood struck. Around 1,545 people had been rescued. The full death toll was expected to rise considerably as rescue teams reached more remote areas and communications disruptions were resolved. The scale of the destruction made the initial response extraordinarily difficult. Access routes into Rasuwa district were largely destroyed by the flood itself. Roads were buried under meters of mud and debris. Bridges were gone. Helicopters became the primary means of reaching affected communities, but communications disruptions in the early hours left rescue coordinators with an incomplete picture of where people were and what had survived. Over 17,000 children were identified as being in immediate need of humanitarian assistance. Hundreds of people were injured, with many being treated in local facilities near the disaster zones rather than transported to Kathmandu. Nepal's government announced free treatment for the injured. Australia committed emergency funding. UNICEF mobilized supplies. China dispatched more than 680 firefighters, rescue dogs, vehicles, and drones to its side of the border, clearing damaged roads to reach those stranded near Gyurong port. By Thursday evening, more than 550 stranded tourists had been relocated and nearly 500 affected villagers evacuated on the Tibetan side alone. The question everyone was asking in the hours after the flood was the same: what caused it, and why was there no warning? The answer that emerged over the following 24 hours pointed to the mountains themselves. Scientists and geophysicists who analyzed the event described what they called a massive geophysical event in the high Himalayas, a large landslide that carried glacial ice with it as it fell. According to Goran Ekstrom of Columbia University's Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, the force of the collapse was equivalent to a 5.2 magnitude earthquake, registering on seismographs around the world. The landslide and glacier collapse released an enormous volume of water that funneled into river valleys and surged downstream with catastrophic speed. Nepal's foreign minister indicated that initial assessments suggested an earthquake may have triggered an avalanche which caused the flooding. The precise sequence of events, whether an earthquake, a glacial lake outburst, a spontaneous landslide, or some combination of these, had not been officially confirmed as of the time of this documentary. What was confirmed was that the early warning system failed. Nepal and China had jointly maintained a flash flood early warning system in the border region for years. The system had a credible track record, credited with preventing casualties in previous flood events. But on August 26, it did not detect the disaster in time to alert communities downstream. Investigators and scientists who assessed the failure identified several reasons. The monitoring techniques the system relied on were more suited to monsoon-style flooding, slower, more predictable rises in water level, than to sudden flash floods of this type. A France-based geomorphologist noted that the sheer volume of water released may have simply destroyed the sensing gauges themselves before they could transmit any alert, disabling the system at the moment it was most needed. A senior analyst at the Stimson Center described the affected region as a monitoring blind spot, an area that had received relatively little attention from geologists and hydrologists compared to other high-risk zones in the Himalayas. The result was that villages had no warning. In some places, the water arrived in seconds. Footage captured by bystanders and shared on social media showed a wall of brown water moving through the valley at a speed that gave no one time to react. For those caught in the open, there was no escape. The climate context surrounding this disaster is significant and cannot be separated from what happened. The Himalayas contain some of the largest concentrations of glacial ice outside the polar regions. As global temperatures have risen, glaciers throughout the range have been retreating and thinning. The volume of water stored in glacial lakes formed by meltwater, pooling behind natural dams of ice and rock, has increased substantially. These lakes are inherently unstable. When the natural dam holding one fails, whether due to an earthquake, a landslide, excessive melt, or structural weakness, the result is what scientists call a glacial lake outburst flood, one of the most dangerous and least predictable natural disaster types in mountain environments. The New York Times and other major outlets reporting on the Nepal disaster noted explicitly that climate change has elevated the risk of exactly this kind of event across the Himalayan region. Nepal sits at the intersection of some of the world's most dramatic terrain and some of its most significant climate-related glacial change. The country has experienced multiple serious flooding events in recent years as a result. Whether the August 26 disaster was directly triggered by glacial lake outburst, by a landslide that incorporated glacial ice, or by another mechanism entirely, the underlying vulnerability, enormous volumes of ice and water stored in unstable high-altitude terrain above populated valleys, is a condition that has been growing for decades and will continue to grow. As rescue operations continued, authorities identified a new and serious secondary threat. The landslide had created a natural dam, a barrier lake, upstream of the flood zone. By August 28, the lake had begun to overflow, and Nepali authorities halted rescue operations in border areas as a precautionary measure. Satellite imagery showed a second lake upstream that appeared to be growing in size. Nepal's Disaster Management Authority warned that further flooding remained a risk until both lakes were fully drained. The situation was being monitored via satellite imagery because the terrain was too dangerous for ground teams to access directly. The investigation into the precise cause of the flood was ongoing as of this documentary. Nepal's government, in coordination with Chinese authorities and international scientific bodies, was working to establish a clearer picture of the triggering event and the sequence that followed. The findings were expected to carry significant implications for how early warning systems are designed and deployed across the broader Himalayan region, not just in Nepal and Tibet, but across all countries in the mountain range. The recovery operation itself faced an enormous logistical challenge. The same terrain that makes Rasuwa district beautiful, narrow river valleys cut between steep mountain walls, made access for heavy equipment nearly impossible. Mud and debris covered roads that had taken years to build. Communities that had relied on the Botekoshi Valley as a trade and travel corridor between Nepal and Tibet were entirely cut off. For the families of the missing, many of them tourists from Europe, Asia, and elsewhere who had come to Nepal to trek, the uncertainty was particularly acute. The remote terrain and the scale of the destruction made systematic search operations slow. Some of the missing may never be formally accounted for. The August 26 disaster was not the first major glacial flood event in the Nepal-Tibet border region. A similar event in 2025 had struck near the same corridor, killing several people and destroying the Sino-Nepal Friendship Bridge at Rasuwa. That event was eventually traced to a glacial lake outburst in the Tibetan region. The 2026 event was vastly larger in scale, but it struck terrain that had already been weakened and disrupted by what came before. Nepal is one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world. It sits on a major tectonic boundary, in a region where the Indian subcontinent collides with the Asian landmass. Earthquakes, landslides, and floods are all part of the natural cycle. The 2015 earthquake killed nearly 9,000 people and displaced hundreds of thousands of
sediment.
Seasonal
Thousands of
monsoon
people
flooding
ran
causes
for their
damage and
lives,
death
climbing
every
onto
year.
rooftops
What is
and
changing
higher
is the
ground as
character
the mud
and scale
spread.
of the glacial
The
component of
disaster
that risk,
continued with
driven by
relentless
warming
force,
temperatures that
turning
are felt more
Kashmiri
intensely at
Bazaar
altitude
into a scene
than
of
almost
total
anywhere else on Earth.
devastation and
The
chaos.
people who live in these valleys have always known the mountains could be dangerous. What August 26, 2026 demonstrated, again, is that the nature of that danger is changing, and that the systems built to protect communities from it have not yet caught up. This is Disaster Archives.